Here we clap twice. That always quiets the crowd down. Good evening and welcome. My name is Winnie Bliss, and I'm on the board of the Friends of the Library. The Friends, in conjunction with the Weston Historical Society, have been sponsoring a fantastic series of lectures and movies about World War I to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the First World War. I want to tell you just a little bit about the Friends, and maybe some of you will be motivated to join us tonight because we have a lot of fun. We basically put together programs for the library, and the programs for kids, for adults, all kinds of things. And we're a volunteer organization, 100% volunteers, and we depend on donations from folks to help us do the things that we do. So if you feel motivated and you brought your checkbook, it's okay to write a check to Friends of the Library. We'll be grateful for that. So again, let me welcome you, and let me also introduce our partners in crime here on this series, Reg Bowden. Reg?
Thank you. Thank you all for coming tonight. It's really neat to see a room so full. As you may know, this is the last lecture in our World War I series. The first one you heard about the start of the war. Then you went into some of the naval activities that were involved in that war. Then you met General Pershing and the American Expeditionary Force. And today we're going to bring the war to an end. Now, a couple of things about the war itself. It lasted 1,560 days. It involved 20 countries across 5 continents. There were 55 million people in arms. When it was over, 9 million were dead. Today we want to talk about the end of the war. And we have the chair of the History Department at Southern Connecticut State University, Dr. Troy Paddock. Troy,
thank you all for coming out on this beautiful autumn evening. I was thought many of you would have better things to do. First of all, I'd like to thank you for coming. Thank Reg and Neil and the Weston Historical Society and the Weston Public Library for inviting me to come. I've been charged with talking about the end of the war and its aftermath, including the Treaty of Versailles. My talk is going to focus more on Germany than the other combatants, and I'm doing this for 2 reasons. One, it's the part that I know best. And 2, I think there are misperceptions in the Anglophone world about the war, and this gives me an opportunity to address some of them. Now, the Germans lost the First World War. They were beaten on the battlefield, at sea, and at home. This simple truth is significant because it was so unexpected in Germany that it's easy to understand why it was rather difficult for some Germans to accept. And you might want to know why. But one important thing to keep in mind is after the initial attacks by the French in Lorraine and the Russians in East Prussia in August of 1914 were repelled, the vast majority of fighting over the next 4 years would not occur on German soil. So the German civilian population did not have the same direct experience of a prolonged war that their French, Belgian, and Russian counterparts had had. On March 3rd, 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk ended Russia's participation in the Great War and ceded to Germany a majority of Eastern Europe. Dark area of that slide is all territory that Russia, or the Russian Empire, former Russian Empire, ceded to Germany to get out of the war. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So going into the spring of 1918, the German civilian population had every reason to think that the war was going well, even if they had suffered quite a bit at home. Yet 6 months later, in September, General Erich Ludendorff, one of the heroes of Tannenberg, told the stunned Reichstag that if Germany did not immediately sue for peace, that the German army was in danger of collapsing completely. by the second week of November, the German military had indeed collapsed. The Kaiser, Wilhelm II, had abdicated, and the revolution of some sort was coming. So one can understand if some Germans were left wondering, what the heck happened? So why did Germany lose the war? There were two basic schools of thought about the keys to Germany's defeat. They emphasize different aspects of the war, but do not necessarily contradict each other. More traditional views point to the British blockade and the Western Front as the keys to the Entente victory in what became a war of attrition. The Entente won simply because they had more men, more weapons, and more supplies than their German and Austrian counterparts. The Germans did not have the time, money, or manpower to incorporate the resources that came from the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Therefore, they could not benefit from any of the material advantages that may have come from the land beyond freeing up the men who had been on the Eastern Front and sending them to the Western Front. I am sympathetic to this view. The British blockade was extraordinarily effective in impacting the German war effort in terms of getting supplies to Germany. The second point of view identifies America's late entry into the war as the turning point. With money, men, and munitions, the US came over and saved Europe from the Germans, as well as from the incompetence of the British and French military leaders. There is something to be said for that latter point of view as well. But you can probably gather the two views aren't incompatible. But I think even if the United States did not enter the war, I simply do not see how Germany could have acquired the resources to win the war. The Germans were going to run out of men, munitions, and food. And let me give you just two examples to illustrate what I'm getting at. With regard to manpower, by 1918, 28% fewer men and 52% more women were employed in the German economy than had been so in 1913. And this was still not enough on the part of Germany to sustain the war effort. They literally could not make enough ammunition to help the Germans continue to fight. As an aside on the economic front, it's worth to note that by 1916, real wages were 20% lower than they had been in 1913. The second point is regarding food. The German government had taken over rationing, distribution, and price controls of grains and bread, and later more and more foodstuffs. The last time I checked, nutritionists recommended a daily intake of approximately 2,250 calories as sort of basic for staying alive in a reasonably healthy fashion. In 1916, Germans could only get 1,350 calories with their ration cards. The winter of 1916-17, referred to as the turnip winter, was even worse, with only 1,000 calories available through rations. Now, what I hope these two examples make clear is why I think the Germans would have had a difficult time winning the war. In a war of attrition, the German Empire did not have the same resources at its disposal as the Entente empires. Now, the withdrawal of the Russian Empire from the war did not fundamentally alter that fact. It is worth noting that in spite of the crushing German victory at Tannenberg in the Masurian Lakes, Germany did not defeat Russia militarily in the First World War. Lenin wanted to stop Russian involvement in the war. Lack of popular support for the war and public agitation for significant reforms at home led to the Russian Revolution in February of 1917. That put Alexander Kerensky in charge of Russia. He faced two important problems when he took over: the war and the need for reform. Kerensky bowed to the wishes of his allies and decided that the reforms would have to wait until the war was over. And if I may be allowed to borrow a line from the knight guarding the Holy Grail in the Indiana Jones movies, he chose poorly. Lenin was able to capitalize on this and was able to lead the October Revolution of 1917 that brought the Bolsheviks to power. One of his first actions was to begin negotiations to end Russia's involvement with the war. And he ceded, as you can see, tremendous amounts of territory to Germany in order to get Russia out of the war. But once again, I need to reiterate, Germany didn't beat Russia. Russia stopped fighting. And I think that's an important distinction. Now, the Russian withdrawal from the war did free up the Eastern Front, but it did not add men or munitions to the army. The Germans were still outnumbered thanks to the influx of American troops and supplies. When the German spring offensive in 1918 was rebuffed by the West, the German army had exhausted itself, prompting Ludendorff's confession to the Reichstag. Now, Ludendorff and Hindenburg's actions deserve a brief special discussion. The two generals had essentially forced William II to demand Chancellor Bethmann Hove, the Chancellor of Germany, to resign. The successors to Bethmann, George Michaelis and then Count Hertling, were not up to the task, and the latter resigned rather than work with a more democratic parliament to try to negotiate a peace. As a result, towards the end of the war, the heir to the throne of the Grand Duchy of Baden, a man by the name of Prince Max von Baden, accepted the chancellorship of a coalition government and negotiated an armistice. Now, the extent of Ludendorff's or disingenuousness is illustrated in his discussion with Baden over the possibility that accepting Wilson's 14 points might mean losing Germany's overseas colonies, Alsace-Lorraine, and perhaps Polish-speaking districts in the eastern provinces. Ludendorff's response was that the Supreme Command would cede the small French-speaking portions of Alsace-Lorraine, but would never cede any territory in the east. Ludendorff continued to argue against any armistice terms that would weaken the army, and even suggested that the army should continue fighting. Fortunately, both the Kaiser and Prince Max rejected this position, and Ludendorff in a huff resigns. Now, the determination of the German military to avoid reality was highlighted by the decision of some naval officers to send out the surface fleet to engage the British, really for the first time since the Battle of Ypres. And after the government had accepted Wilson's conditions for peace. In late October, some battleship crews refused to execute the orders, and 600 Navy personnel were imprisoned in the German city of Kiel. Demands for their release led to an uprising on November 4th. At the same time, but unrelated to those Navy revolts, there were revolts in Munich and in Berlin. Max von Baden announced the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II and the Crown Prince, even before the Kaiser had actually made up his mind to abdicate, and the immediate appointment of Friedrich Ebert as Chancellor. Ebert promised to govern constitutionally and to call for a national assembly. Now, while Germany tried to create a new government, the Allies designed a peace treaty to end the First World War. Germany had planned a peace on Wilson's 14 points, which had been designed to keep Russia in the war. Now, the points were open to various interpretations. At every turn, the interpretation of the points, which were incorporated into the treaty, and not all of them were always the worst possible interpretation for Germany. Now, Prince Max von Baden had wanted the interpretations laid out on the table before he accepted the points, but his cabinet refused to back him, and of course the Entente powers refused to cooperate with that. And now, to give you just a few examples of what I mean by various interpretations. Point 8 was righting the wrong done to France in 1871. What does that mean? It's obviously a territorial one. If you see Alsace-Lorraine were the two territories that were ceded to Germany at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, and sort of the last piece to create for a united Germany. So righting the wrong to France, does that mean they go back to France? Or because ethnically it's a very mixed population, and linguistically it's actually a majority German. Is there a plebiscite and they get to vote? Well, Wilson, who wanted to make the world safe for democracy, did not want democracy in Alsace-Lorraine. It goes back to the French. Poland wants to have secure access to the sea. That's understandable. Poland, which for close to a century and a quarter had been what one Prussian general called a geographical expression, was now back on the map. The question was, what do you do? And the city of Danzig, which now you probably all know as Gdansk, was turned into a free city. And this dark purple area becomes known as the Polish corridor, in order to ensure that Poland would have unfettered access to the sea, because there was fear that if the Germans controlled Polish access to the sea, they could have an undue influence on the Polish economy. So they wanted to make sure that Germany didn't have that capability. The Silesia and the Sudetenland, that self-determination did not happen, and as a result, areas that had German majorities became part of Poland or part of the newly created Czechoslovakian nation. One last example is the question of disarmament. Some of you may remember that World War I was going to be the war to end all wars. But sadly, that was an over-optimistic view of war. But the Germans wondered, does disarmament mean everyone's going to disarm to try to prevent this kind of carnage again, or only Germany? Well, as the treaty points out, it would be only Germany. And so, even though Baden was right about wanting to know about what the conditions could be before, he's not supported. One of the most telling aspects about this is that the German government was determined to keep the German public uninformed. The German public had no idea that it could be a harsh peace. And it was a reasonably harsh peace. Germany lost 1/7 of its territory, 1/10 of its population, 1/3 of its coal-producing ability, and about 78% of its iron ore. I'm trying to figure out the color changes up there. It loses Alsace-Lorraine. It loses North Schleswig, which is the little color area right beneath Denmark. It loses it to Denmark. It loses a tiny strip of territory to Belgium. It loses West Prussia and Posen to Poland. It loses Danzig. East Prussia is once again separated from Prussia. The Sudetenland is given to the Czechs. It loses all of its colonies. The Anschluss, or union with Austria, is denied, even though they talk about sort of ethnic self-determination. In 1918-1919, Austrians, the majority of Austrians probably would have wanted to unite with Germany, which is actually important because in 1938, the majority probably didn't want to. But all of these are determined, from the German perspective, against Germany. The French were quite concerned about the ability of a post-war Germany to recover quickly and perhaps try again. This is one of the few issues where the French weren't overreacting. Most of the war had not been fought on German soil, and even with the loss of Alsace-Lorraine, the Saar and the Ruhr region provide Germany with a solid industrial base that was still intact. France had wanted to annex the Saar, but instead it is put under French protection with a plebiscite to be held 15 years later. It was held 15 years later and went overwhelmingly. I don't remember the exact percentage, but I know it was like over 85% voted to return to Germany. But Germany's military power was severely weakened. The German fleet was scrapped, the size of its army was reduced, as well as its length of service, as well as limiting the general staff and the kind of weapons the military could have. But as most of you probably know, if your economy is intact, converting to a wartime economy to produce weapons is not that great a leap. And this is precisely why the French were worried. The issue that gets a tremendous amount of attention is reparations, to make Germany liable for the cost of the war. In spite of all that has just been mentioned, from the German perspective, the focal point of the treaty was Article 231, which blamed Germany for the war and all losses and damages. This was done to legitimize reparations, but psychologically it was devastating to Germany. But it also needs to be noted that the war guilt clauses were not legally necessary in order to impose reparations. This was a political decision that ultimately caused more harm than many subsequent historians have realized. Now, the Germans weren't prepared for the treaty. They began negotiating against it from the war guilt clause on, instead of on concrete issues. Many in Germany, and not just on the right, wanted to reject the treaty completely. But the Center Party, under the leadership of Matthias Erzberger, realized, and this is a quote, that in order to prevent the worst, we must accept the treaty, end quote. The worst would have been a continued English blockade and an effective strangulation and starvation of Germany. General Groener, who was now the head of the German military, confessed that the treaty had to be accepted. The first government, under the leadership of Chancellor Bruno Bauer, accepted the treaty. The entire right wing of the parliament refuses to ratify the treaty, but admits that the Weimar coalition is doing what is in the best interest of Germany. this is the kind of cowardice, and really that's what it is, that characterizes the political right in Germany. They will spend the next 12 years denouncing the treaty and proclaiming their political integrity and purity by not having voted for the treaty, but yet they admit that there was no other alternative. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but I wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of the political parties that existed in Germany at the end of the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles had added insult to injury to the German population looking for answers. And as a result, the first elections in 1919, 1920, there was a huge swing to the right. And the Reichstag, which is just a German word for Congress or Parliament, holds hearings on why Germany collapses. And here, military luminaries Hindenburg and Ludendorff say that the German army did not lose on the battlefield, they lost on the home front. And this is where the infamous stab in the back legend comes from. And it becomes a very popular leader among German conservatives to explain Germany's plight. And now just very quickly, these are actually the major political parties. Starting on the top left and going down. KPD is the Communist Party of Germany. USPD, Independent Socialist Party of Germany. SPD, Socialist Party of Germany. DDP, German Democratic Party. DDP, German People's Party. Center Party, which is actually the Catholic Party in Germany. DNDP, German National People's Party. BDP, Bavarian People's Party. And NSDAP, National Socialist German Workers' Party, also known as the Nazi Party later on. BVP is worth noting. Bavaria is sort of the German equivalent of Texas. It has to be different. And it's even true today. I don't know if you know anything about German politics, but in most of Germany you have the Conservative Party is the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union. In Bavaria, its equivalent is the CSU, the Christian Social Union. And they're the same party, they're coalition, but Bavaria has to be different. It just has to be. The dual burdens of defeat and the peace treaty left the government of the new German Republic, usually referred to as Weimar Germany, with blames that were not of its doing. Nevertheless, the former military and government leaders did their best to blame the new Germany for the failures of the departed Kaiserreich. Popular resentment towards the new government and the treaty played an important role in the rise of a little-known right-wing party called the National Socialist German Workers' Party. I would like to take a few moments to explain the role that these two factors play. The War Guilt Clause was used to legitimize reparations. And Article 231, as I said, is the War Guilt Clause. And if you wonder why I say they're used to legitimize reparations, Articles 232 through 234 deal with reparations. This is clearly an attempt to structure a legal argument when you don't need to have a legal argument. But the First World War was expensive, and the victorious powers wanted the Germans to foot the bill. Regarding reparations, while the bill for the war ultimately handed to Germany was extraordinarily high, the Germans could have paid reparations. And I've seen different studies, but the one that seems the most credible to me says that if nothing had happened, like the Great Depression or World War II, after the Treaty of Versailles, Germany would have finished paying off reparations in 1987. So that gives you an idea of how long it would have taken to pay reparations. But saying that, Gerald Feldman's work demonstrated that rather than make a good faith effort to pay reparations, the government pursued a deliberately inflationary policy with disastrous consequences. And some of you may be familiar with these pictures of children taking stacks of money and throwing them into a cabina to burn for warmth, or the picture of a woman taking a wheelbarrow full of money to a store to get milk or bread. Quite literally, the paper was worth more than the denomination of money that it represented. I mean, you have hyperinflation that by November of 1923, $1 would get you 4.2 trillion marks. Yeah, I mean, it's staggering. So, but this is, but the government's responsible for this. The German government could have paid this off, but it didn't want to. It pouted. It deliberately destroyed its own economy to say, you see, we can't afford to do this, and that's why the 1924 Dawes Plan comes into effect. And the Dawes Plan, for those of you who don't know about this, it's a beautifully American United States lends money to Germany. Germany takes this money and helps repay France and Britain. France and Britain take some of that money to repay the loans to the United States. I mean, it's beautiful. It's wonderful. But the inclusion of that war guilt clause was not necessary to exact reparations. Rather, it was an attempt to provide the Entente powers with the moral high ground. I don't have any issues with reparations. In a previous time, it would have just been called the spoils of victory. At the end of the Franco-Prussian War, the new Germany made France pay 5 billion francs as an indemnity. For better or worse, making the loser pay is a privilege of victory. What was a colossal mistake was the inclusion of that clause of responsibility. Not only was it not necessary, but I would argue that it's historically inaccurate. I don't think Germany was primarily responsible for causing the war. In fact, of the great continental powers, I can make a pretty compelling argument that Germany was the least interested in a war in the summer of 1914. Now, I recognize that this is a minority view, but I would side, that's okay. But I would side with historians like Terence Zuber, who in my mind proves not only was there no such thing as a Schlieffen Plan, but that the German war planning in the years before the war did not involve preventative wars. And I can talk more about this in the Q&A if people are interested. But I would argue that Article 231 is included at least in part to obscure the culpability of the Entente powers, who were far from innocent victims of German aggression. But the German government and the German people resented their country having to shoulder the blame for the war. The people blamed the new government for accepting the treaty, even though there was no rational alternative for a responsible government to take. Now, as a general rule, I'm opposed to the recent trend of what-if kind of history that is called counter-history. That is, history of something else other than what had happened. A recent example comes to mind from the Memorial Day 3-part series on the History Channel about the 2 world wars. There's a moment, there's the mention of an English soldier who had a chance to shoot a defenseless soldier, later identified as Hitler. What if he had shot him? Now, I will concede this makes for a fun parlor game, or maybe a fun drinking game. But as a practicing historian, I reject the term counter-history in favor of what it really is, fiction. Now, that said, if the 20th century were allowed one golfer's mulligan, it could do worse than eliminating Article 231 from the Versailles Treaty. While the one item that a politically fractured Germany could agree upon was the war guilt clause, it was the political right in Weimar Germany that was able to make it a successful wedge issue. Conservative, nationalist, political, and military figures used the peace treaty and war guilt clause as a club to beat the legitimacy out of the Weimar government, arguing that the signing of the treaty was an act of treason against Germany, even though, as I noted, they privately admitted there was no alternative. One such figure is Adolf Hitler, whose oratorical skills and political instincts took a little-known group of disaffected men who called themselves the German Workers' Party and transformed them into the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Hitler was a master propagandist, and while most of his revisionist autobiography, Mein Kampf, is filled with lies, half-truths, and nonsense, Chapter 6 of Book 1, called War Propaganda, is surprisingly lucid, and I would argue it should be required reading for anyone who's interested in marketing, advertising, or politics as a vocation, because its insights still apply today. In that chapter, Hitler makes a few essential points. 1, propaganda is for the masses, not the intellectual. Its content must be simple, not complicated. 2, it must be repeated without deviation. Point 3, it must be black and white. Our side is good, the other side is evil. As soon as you concede the opposition may have a point or some human decency, then doubt creeps in. That sounds disturbingly familiar. Yes. Now, Hitler followed these lessons well. In 1920, he took over the German Workers' Party and renamed it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and he published a party program, and some of the points are up there. And it's good political propaganda. We demand the unification of all Germans in the Greater Germany on the basis of the right of self-determination of peoples. Okay. We demand equality of rights for the German people and respect to other nations. abrogation of the peace treaties of Versailles and Saint-Germain. Saint-Germain is the peace treaty that takes the former Austro-Hungarian Empire out of the war. We demand land and territory for sustenance of our people, the colonization of our surplus population. Here, this would get to your point about anti-Semitism, is only a member of the race can be a citizen. A member of the race can only be one who is of German blood without consideration of creed. Consequently, no Jew can be a member of the race. Now, you could argue, is that a consideration of creed or not, but then that gets into a whole different set of questions. Whoever has no citizenship is able to live in Germany only as a guest and must be under the authority of legislation for foreigners. So they're already, even before the Nazis come to power, they definitely have what we would call a sort of a very ethnic, or for being blunt, a very racist notion of what constitutes being a German citizen. If you don't have German blood, you're not a German. And this is actually a question that haunts Germany even up to about a decade after the fall of the wall. The only point I want to talk about in this last one is point 8, where it says, any further immigration of non-citizens is to be prevented. We demand that all non-Germans who have migrated to Germany since the 2nd of August 1914, the beginning of the First World War, be forced immediately to leave the Reich. Now, the failed beer hall putsch of 1923 forced Hitler to realize he would have to acquire power legally. He pursued a propaganda campaign that emphasized traditional German values and denounced the Versailles Treaty and the burden of reparations. So let's take a little bit of a look at some Nazi propaganda posters. These are early posters from the Nazis, post beer hall putsch. One on the left, Brecht das Ketten, break the chains of the Dawes Agreement. The one on the right, Deutschland's Befreiung, Germany's liberation. The imagery that the Nazis will constantly use is that the Treaty of Versailles has enchained Germany, that Germany is basically being a prisoner or a slave. And Hitler will portray that the Nazis will be the people capable of breaking that chain. And the list is worth noting, because where you stood on the list was determined by how many seats you had won in the previous election. So they were only the 10th most popular party at the time that that poster was coming out. So you got to Befreiung again. The other one says Berlin. In spite of the ban not dead, this is after the beer hall putsch when the Nazis were temporarily banned. Two things are interesting about this. One is 19, which I'll admit for the life of me, I'm still not sure what the heck it means. We demand substitution of a German common law in place of Roman law serving a materialistic world order. The Germans don't really have a common law tradition the way the British do, so that's why I wonder exactly what the heck he's talking about with that. What is worth noting for 20 and 21, and you don't need to read them, is the National Socialist program is very state-oriented in the sense that, if you read through all of them, the individual has a right to do things as long as they help promote the state. If you're not doing something that's constructive for the state, it's to be discouraged. So it's all for liberties, but it's liberties that help promote the state. The Germans, once they get into power, are also pretty good at doing, much more positive propaganda. This is the Landwirtschaftsfest. It's basically an agricultural festival. And this is, you can see it's held in Munich in '33. There's another one for the farmers. These are all, this is up in Kiel. And these are very positive, sort of, good traditional, German agrarian values. Not to forget the industrious, we have the German week, German goods, German work. That's what it says on the left. And this is Hitler rebuilds, help with, buy German wares. Same as buy American. it's true though, but part of the way Hitler helps get Germany out of the Great Depression is through mass public works projects. The Autobahn is essentially part of Hitler's New Deal. And, it's a German construction project to put people to work. And of course, the great countercultural irony is the Volkswagen was actually invented during Hitler's time to be the people's wagon. And of course, this little Nazi car becomes a counterculture symbol in the 60s. So great historical irony. Hitler was extraordinarily effective and sadly, as we all know, able to achieve power. The Treaty of Versailles cannot be blamed for Hitler's rise to power. There are too many German politicians between Friedrich Ebert and Paul von Hindenburg who must take blame for willfully damaging Germany's political and economic institutions to the extent that Hitler could actually appear as a viable alternative. The Germans themselves have to take blame for Hitler's rise first and foremost. That said, how the peace treaty negotiations were handled and the inclusion of the Warfield Clause gave recalcitrant Germans something to rebel against and feel victimized. Fortunately, these mistakes were not repeated in the Second World War, where Germany's defeat and culpability could not be questioned, and where the peace was not as draconian. But the Second World War, and this is the last point I want to make, impacted how we understood the First World War. Not surprisingly, the question everyone was concerned with after the end of the Second World War was, why 1933, which was shorthand for, why did Hitler come to power? How is that possible? Where do we find the origins of Nazism? During the 1930s and 40s, a spate of books appeared that allowed authors to pick their least favorite German and make him responsible for National Socialism. Titles such as From Luther to Hitler, From Bismarck to Hitler, From Nietzsche to Hitler are just a few examples. A classic post-war posing of reveals the bias that has dominated German and European historiography for most of the 20th century. It comes from Ralph Dahrendorf, who wrote a book called Society and Democracy in Germany, where he frames the question like this: why wasn't Germany England? England was taken as the norm for development of a modern nation state. And this is why Fritz Fischer, who's a German historian who wrote a very controversial book about German war aims. This is why Fischer was so controversial and influential. As another historian, Richard Evans, noted, Fischer and his followers had narrowed the focus of debate by confining it to Germany and placing it within a longer-term account of the origins of Nazism, and argued that Germany had trodden a special path, a Sonderweg, to modernity, involving the enthronement of domestic authoritarianism and international aggrandizement at the center of power. So robust was this narrative that for a time it carried all before it. So while ostensibly about the First World War, Fischer's book was an explanation for the rise of the Nazis. Put simply, what Fischer and later historians would say was that conservative elites were able to retain power and influence in spite of Germany's loss in the First World War, and that their anti-democratic convictions paved the way for Hitler's ascension to power. So the Second World War, a case where Germany's aggression and guilt are indisputable, is used to reinforce the idea of German militarism and aggression as innate German traits. I think I'm going to stop there rather than talking more about other German historians. I think I've gone on long enough. So I'm going to thank you for your attention. Yes, sir.
Was the British blockade still in effect all during the 1919 negotiations for the Versailles Treaty? So the Germans had a gun held to their head at this point, right?
Yes. Yes.
If you felt that Germany was not really the most responsible for the war, who would you say is?
Yeah, I mean, a whole bunch, but I think there's a really interesting book that came out a couple years back called The Russian Origins of the First World War. And I think you can make a very compelling argument that both Russia and France were much more interested in a war in 1914 than Germany was. And I would make that argument. I don't. The idea that it's Germany's fault to me is utter nonsense. It fits a wonderful historiographical debate, and because the Nazis are just so undoubtedly evil that their forefathers are assumed to be just as guilty. Yes, and then.
Two questions. First of all, I thought Germany, the fundamental provocation of the war was Germany did want to become like England, particularly in terms of naval power, to control many parts of the world. Second question has to do with the religious composition of Germany at the time of World War I. Was it largely Catholic or Protestant or both?
It's both, but it's a majority Protestant.
Majority Protestant?
Yeah, not by a lot. They would lose a lot of that after the Treaty of Versailles because the part that became Poland was where a lot of German Catholics were. They would lose. But Bavaria is mostly Catholic. And if you go down the Rhine region, like by the cities of Cologne, Mainz, Trier, that area, that's all Catholic. Those were archbishoprics of the whole Hitler's an Austrian Catholic. Yes. As for the Navy, there were some Germans who would have argued that if there is a world power, it's actually Britain, and that if Germany wants to be a world power, it needs to have a formidable navy. But he never thought, or I would argue, it never tried to get a navy that could defeat Britain. The whole thing that Alfred von Tirpitz, who was the architect of the German Navy, was what he called a risk strategy. The idea that the German Navy would be strong enough that Britain wouldn't want to risk a battle with it, because even though Britain would win, it would be weakened to the point that another naval power could then perhaps take advantage of it. And you were next, and then.
Well, save some of the high school kids. I'll yield my question for a moment.
Yes.
For the high school kids.
I was gonna, sorry.
No, I'm going to have the same question.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I was gonna ask about, you said something that you don't really believe there is such thing as a sleeping
The sleeping plan, yes.
Right. So what caused Germany to want to attack France and therefore have to go to Belgium?
Okay, now the question is, did Germany want to attack France?
Okay.
Look at it this way. At the same time the Germans are invading Belgium, the French are invading Germany.
Oh.
The French have a fortification along, let's go back to this actually might be a better map, but we'll use the old one. It's a little better. After the Franco-Prussian War, the French had worked on their fortifications along the Franco-German border, obviously, because the French were declining demographically. They were scared to death of the Germans, and they had every right to be. A direct war between the two of them, one-on-one, the Germans won. But they didn't build fortifications along the line of Belgium, so there was the idea for Germany as a counterattack, and this is the stuff that Terence Zuber, the historian I mentioned, which I think is really interesting, is when the German General Staff does their war games under Schlieffen, it's always the Germans counterattacking to a French or Franco-Russian attack. So it seems to me that it's not a war of aggression the way sort of subsequent historians talk about. No, I'll admit my view is a minority view, but I think Zuber's right because it assumes that the French didn't want a war, that the French were dragged into a war, and that's hooey. That's the polite technique. One of the things that never gets talked about is, what did Poincaré talk about during that trip in July to St. Petersburg? The record after says, oh, this was never discussed. It was discussed, and we have proof of it. We know that the Russian foreign minister knew about the Austrian ultimatum 5 days before it was delivered, which means that Sazonov, the Russian prime minister, knew about it before Poincaré comes. Do you think, seriously, that he's not going to talk about it to Poincaré while they're there? If you believe that, I got a bridge I want to sell you. So, I don't know if I answered. I think they go through Belgium because if their plan is if they have to fight a two-front war, is they want to try to not fight them simultaneously. So if they can beat the French quickly, then they can focus on Russia, which in their ideal scenario, Russia, because it's so much larger and less developed, is going to take them much longer to mobilize effectively. And so they think if they can beat the French quickly, then they can worry about the Russians. As it turned out, they didn't beat the Russians quickly and have to worry about the French. Yes?
Okay, so in your defense, I don't know what your 10th grader was, because I had a 10th grader last year, and she did this course, and I was enthralled by it and read a little bit, which is dangerous about it. But one of the things I recall from that 10th grade course, and then also the Guns of August,
Beautifully written book.
with which
Not
I
the
will
same.
take exception, and I've read some other ones, was that at least in terms of the Schleifen plan,
Schlieffen.
the Schlieffen, that what it consisted of, in a nutshell, and high schoolers can tell me if I'm wrong, I'm sure, is that Germany was willing to do what the French were not. And Schlieffen's idea was, if we're the first to breach Belgian neutrality, then we will have a 3-week advantage over the French, thus making in the small historiography, or the simple historiography, the Germans the bad guys and the French, they're clearly not the good guys, which you're utterly correct, they wanted more. So is that so wrong? That
Yes.
Schlieffen? I live for the 10th graders to figure that out with their teacher, because I think that's what they're taught, and I agree with that.
I think that's what they're taught, and I think they're wrong.
Interesting.
No, I mean, if you get to the point of talking about the Schlieffen plan, and if you're really interested in this stuff, there's a small journal called War and History that starting in 1999, when Zuber wrote an article called The Schlieffen Plan Reconsidered. It starts a long debate between him and another Terence Holmes, about the Schlieffen Plan, what it was and what it wasn't. And what's interesting about it is, what they end up arguing about is whether the Schlieffen Plan was actually a plan for a single front assault on France in 1905, during the Moroccan crisis. There's no way in God's green earth that this was a plan for something almost a decade later.
After he was dead, I understand.
It just wasn't. The perfectly legitimate and great question is, if this never existed, then why the heck do we have this notion of the Schlieffen Plan? Well, General Brunner, who I mentioned, General Kuhl, and a couple of others who were in charge of the military after, and also in charge of trying to explain what happened, they look at scapegoats, and they use von Moltke, who is dead, as the scapegoat. And they say, Moltke had this perfect plan from Schlieffen, and he botched it. He took troops away from the right wing too early and sent them to Russia. If he had left them there, we could have won. No. It doesn't work. Here's to me the easiest question that I can ask people who think there was a Schlieffen Plan. If you look at what that plan calls for, and for those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about, the Schlieffen Plan is a memo. It's called Denkschrift. It's essentially a memo that's written up after he retires in early 1906. And it has discussions about how an attack on France could go. Now, what's interesting about this memo is it includes 24 divisions that have no physical counterpart. They do not exist. Now, I'll admit I'm a pacifist at heart. I haven't spent a second in the military, but I have tremendous respect for military leaders. I don't think they're going to go into a war with a plan that counts on make-believe truce. The good military leaders I've encountered hate using their troops. They don't want to use them unless it's absolutely necessary. I can't think of a single serious military commander who's going to go into a battle knowing they have 1/3 fewer troops than they need to execute a plan and say, oh, what the hell, let's do it anyway.
Weston, you fight with the army you have.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the army he had is still damn good. Yes, please.
We're talking about the impact of World War I, and we haven't even mentioned the United States or Woodrow Wilson.
Well, I said I was going to talk about the German perspective.
I remember a quote that I read at one point of Clemenceau. describing the peace conference at Versailles, saying he thought he did pretty well as he was sitting next to a man who thought he was Jesus Christ. Which I think, yeah, clearly there was a major change in the United States role in the world at the end of World War I. Don't you think?
Wilson intended for there to be a major change in the United States because of his humility. He failed miserably. I mean, listen, the peace treaty wasn't even approved by the American Congress.
Right.
He, brilliant man, PhD, political scientist down in Princeton, smarter than I'll ever be, probably forgotten more than I'll ever know. The difficulty with that is he also thought he was smarter than everybody else, and that he knew everything. And he didn't even bring any members of the opposition party with him on the peace negotiations. Politically, he was stupid.
And he gave us the income tax. I don't think he ever changed it.
He kept John warm. Yes, sir.
Oh, I was just wondering if Germany thought that Britain had such a formidable empire, then why would they risk invading through Belgium into France if they knew that might involve Britain?
Excellent question. The short answer is probably desperation. Because the Germans are convinced if Russia and France are both going full force at the same time, they can't win.
But if they're scared of France's fortifications, then why don't they just defend against France? Why do they need to launch a counterattack?
That's a good question. I don't have a good answer. I think that's the right way to have approached it. If I can be the armchair quarterback a century later. Yeah, dig in. If the French are so determined to attack you, then make them attack.
It's still cut off the head type of, you want to beat the troops at the front, you go behind the lines and get...
Well, I understand the strategy, but the point he's making, and I think he's absolutely right, is that as soon as Germany invades Belgium, any hope, and it may have been remote to begin with, but any hope that Britain would stay on the sideline is gone.
Yeah. Because I asked the lecturer 2 or 3 weeks ago a similar question, and he was saying that they just completely underestimated Britain and had no idea, they thought that they had a small army and everything, but the way that you were saying it, they completely looked up to Britain and wanted, kind of be like them, have a navy like them. But I don't really see them just kind of leaving Britain out of the equation, trying to catch them.
They were hoping like heck to keep Britain out of it. They really were. And for those of you who are diplomatic geeks, Sean McMeekin has written a really interesting book called July 1914. It's like 500 pages, everything from the assassination to the beginning of the war. It's really good. If you're really interested in all the ins and outs.
But people make mistakes. I mean, after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, Germany declared war on us. How stupid can you get? I mean, they wanted to show solidarity with their allies in the East, so they opened up a whole can of worms that they were in no shape to face. So people make mistakes.
Yes, although Hitler was never accused of being a Mexican.
Right, that's true.
And the other thing to keep in mind,
The Workers' Party started out as the Thule movement, if you want to remember. So
No,
that
I
was
know.
a back to nature.
the full society.
Yeah, the Thule Society was a back to nature Woodstock type of organization that was transformed into the Democratic Workers' Party that made the Volkswagen that was brought to Woodstock. So it went a full circle.
Yes.
My understanding is on the matter of invasion through Belgium, that it was a miscalculation on the part of German leadership. It was sort of a gamble.
It was a gamble, and they didn't count on the amount of resistance from Belgium that they got. I mean, what's also interesting, and this is also the stuff that never gets talked about, is the French and British also had contingency plans that would take them through Belgium to attack Germany. But because Germany did it first, they're the evil ones. Yes?
I'd like to ask a question that approaches it from a different standpoint. You've got basically 2 or 3 empires. You've got the British Empire, you've got the Austria-Hungary, and you got the Ottoman Empire. Of the 3 that I just mentioned, which was the most prosperous? I mean, taking
German Empire,
consideration.
easily. It's not even close. The German Empire is easily the most prosperous.
I see.
I mean, they have the second leading economy in the world. Only
I don't
behind the
mean
United
today, I
States.
mean then,
No, then.
you know.
They had the second, they had already surpassed Great Britain in every significant industrial category. Only the United States, and they were even better than the United States in some. But, you know, everyone recognized at that point that the United States was the growing industrial power.
Were they as predominant as the Ottoman and the Austro-Hungary Empire as far as their colonial possessions?
No, well, actually, no, I mean, the Austro-Hungarian Empire has no colonial possessions to speak of unless you're going to talk about, you know, the nations that Austria loses as a result. I mean, the Germans have, you know, are latecomers in the scramble for Africa. You know, they have, you know, German Southwest Africa, German East Africa, is it Tobago there? They have two small colonies up near Liberia.
Togo.
Cameroon, Togo, thank you. And then they also have ports along the Chinese coast. I mean, they have a colonial presence, but, you know, they're a distant fourth or fifth
Thank you.
in that regard. Yes?
I think you could argue that the German leadership did not understand the United States either in 1914 or in 1941.
Okay.
And they sent America into the war, and in the First World War, by unrestricted submarine warfare, which was tactically brilliant but strategically stupid, because it brought America into the war. And in 1941, the Germans declared war on America before America declared war on Germany. Again,
Yeah, I
they had
understand
no
that.
idea what they were doing.
But you know, Hitler declaring war on America is really kind of superfluous. Seriously, I mean, he declared war on America, and then what exactly did he do that was a hostile action towards the United States?
That's it.
Yeah. So I mean, you know, it was a symbolic gesture. It was entirely empty. You know, could it have been used as fuel to help aggravate the United States more? Yeah, but I think the United States was reasonably aggravated at the time.
Hitler knew nothing about the United States.
Yes, that's absolutely true. He dramatically underestimated the United States. He thought that he could get away with declaring war on the United States because the United States was going to be so involved with the war in the Pacific that it would not have the resources to also contribute to the war in Europe. And he was dead wrong. I mean, that, to me, the amazing thing about World War II is that the United States economy is actually able to successfully prosecute two distinct wars. Because the war in the Pacific has an entirely different set of needs than the war on the European continent. It's amazing. You don't see anything like that since the days of the old Roman Empire in terms of total war. You know, it's stunning, and Hitler had no idea of that. That's part of the reason why he invades Russia, because he thinks the only reason Churchill hasn't sued for peace is because he's hoping either the Soviet Union or the United States will get involved. He's thinking the United States is going to be involved in the war in the Pacific. If I can defeat the Soviet Union, which was always his goal in the beginning, his Lebensraum space is Eastern Europe. Push the Russians over the Urals, then we'll be happy. And so that's what he decides to do. He's dead wrong. Yes?
This young lady said.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm very sorry. Please.
Germany wanted to not go through France's border. Why wouldn't they cut through Switzerland?
What was the question?
If Germany wanted to go through France, why would they want to cut through Switzerland instead of Belgium? The terrain in Switzerland is much less friendly. The chocolates, well, actually the chocolate's not there. Belgian chocolate's pretty good. Did you have another question? Okay. Yes? No.
Okay. If the alliance between Germany and Austria-Hungary, was that ever beneficial to Germany?
Oh, great question. Honest answer, no. No, I mean, the alliance between them was one of, there's an ethnic affinity with the Austro part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But, Germany is feeling more and more alone, and so they, as that entente grows, they hold tighter and tighter to Austria-Hungary. Yes?
Can you talk just briefly about what your view of Russia's role in this was? Because you said before that you would call them one of the most culpable, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on it.
Oh, easily. I think with the assassination of the Archduke Francis Ferdinand in Sarajevo, it's already now, it's beyond dispute that Serbia had a role in it, officially. They denied it forever, but it's pretty clear that Serbian officials helped support the underground movement that organized the assassination. It is also pretty clear that with the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, and this is a quick aside, we focus so much on the Western Front in the Anglophone world. The really interesting stuff, frankly, is going on in the East. And the origins of the war are the Eastern Front. And you really need to understand World War I, not as a war of nation states, but as a war of empires. And since the time of at least Catherine the Great, Russia wants control of the Bosphorus and Dardanelles. Because once they get their warm water port in the Black Sea, you still have the straits there, at Constantinople, now Istanbul, that protect it. They want Istanbul. If they have that, then they have access to the Mediterranean. Then they can threaten the British into control of the Suez Canal. That's their brass ring that they want to get. They see this as an opportunity to attack a further weakening Ottoman Empire. I mean, we always sort of think about wars in relation to other wars. How many of you have thought about World War I as the third Russian-Turkish war? Because you have the Crimean War in the 1850s, you have the Russo-Turkish War in 1878. So in a span of 5 years, you have 3 wars between Russia and the declining Ottoman Empire. And in one of those wars was the Ottoman Empire the aggressor. And so they see this as an opportunity. They are desperate to make sure that they have French support, because they know if they have to take on Germany and Austria-Hungary at the same time, they're in trouble. But they know that if they have French support, they have a fighting chance, and even a very good chance that they can get British support. But they hide their mobilization. I mean, they begin mobilizing on the 25th of July, a full 6 days before the Germans order mobilization. But yet Germany is responsible. Now, I'm not saying Germany's innocent. There are no innocents here. Kaiser Wilhelm and Bettmann Holding do some stupid things. The blank check is a terrible idea. It's a stupid idea. Now, it was done under false sort of assumptions, one of them being that they give them a check, Austria knows they have their support, they're going to go to it right away. No, first the Hungarian Prime Minister, Count Tisza, objects to any kind of military solution. He doesn't want to do that. Then after he becomes convinced, oh no, it's harvest season. The Austrian military wants to make sure that their soldiers can do the harvest before they're mobilized. So they have to wait another 2 weeks. Yes?
One of the titles for tonight was its relationship to what's happening today.
No, I'm afraid you said it's aftermath. That just sort of meant, for me, the aftermath was the Nazis. That's what I was told.
Okay.
So something else in the aftermath too. It's not
Oh,
the
the
war
Middle
to
East.
end all wars. This was the war to end all royalty. Is that?
Yeah, you could make that argument.
But we still have the
Queen. Isn't that really what matters? We have the Queen.
Almost lost her a decade ago. People were ready
Yes, sir.
to
Question about the Treaty of Sèvres, which I believe was in 1922, which basically divided up the Ottoman Empire according to the wishes of England and France. And it seems to me that current events are suggesting that rather arbitrary Anglophile approach to the area is potentially a true disaster.
Yeah, that was a disaster. The Balfour Declaration was a disaster. And then even before that, in 16, was it Chico? Thanks, Sykes-Picot. Is another. They're all disasters. But to get the true explanation of how that's messed up, you need to talk to my colleague Steve Jett. He's our Middle Eastern historian. He can explain to you in such charming detail how stupid that was. Yes, sir.
This was actually a question I did want to ask. So, before World War I, Germany, and I know that you'll agree, was Certainly the Germans believe that.
And most Americans do.
And I understand. What happened in the aftermath of World War I, or in World War I, that took this brilliant people from the center of intellectual force of the world to 30 years later, the most barbarous force in the world? A question,
it's a wonderful question. It would probably take 6 months to think of a really good, thoughtful answer. Since I have 60 seconds, I'll give you the flip one. Losing has its consequences. You are allowed, you have the luxury of cultivating the arts when your stomach is full. And I think that's, it's kind of simple, but I think it's a basic truth. Now, Germany spent, and granted, a lot of it was its own doing, 13 years struggling to regain its kilter, then the Nazis take over, and goodness, they destroy everything. And they're rebuilding after that. And they have to build from the ground up. I mean, they lose so much just in terms of brain drain. The intellectuals who flee the Nazis and who will never return. They have to build back up. And their university system is good. Now it's comparable to anywhere in the world. If I wanted to be really flip, I could say take a look at the United States. Are we heading in that direction?
Why?
I think I will concede Richard Hofstadter's point that there's always been a strong strain of anti-intellectualism in the United States. But when you have leaders doubting science, and doubting scientists because they'd rather listen to what their constituents say, that is such a dangerous path. That now to be educated is to be, having an education is almost a sign of weakness or of sort of moral turpitude. It's stunning. When you listen to political debate talking about anything, the level of discourse is so low. I go back to war propaganda. I'm serious. It sounds bizarre because if you read Mein Kampf, Ralph Mannheim has done sort of the standard translation of Mein Kampf. And he wrote in one of the introductions, he said, there are a couple of times where down at the bottom of the page, I'm going to leave the original German. So I want you to show that sentence is not that I didn't know how to translate it, it's that sentence was so ugly in the original German. It's not a good read. But that chapter is remarkably lucid. And if you want to get into advertising, you want to get into politics, it's there. And I defy anyone to tell me that advertising in politics and anywhere in Western democratic societies don't follow that. They just do. And it's depressing, but it's true. Do you have your hand up or you just stretch it? Okay.
No, I just had a question on,
sure.
You had a lot, on this topic. You had a lot of stuff on the German, what they were looking at, in terms of getting people out of the, out of the area. And I would see that there might be a diaspora out of Germany at a time when they left their actual, really areas, by leaving, getting people out of their country. And I think to the U.S., I think we made a better situation out of that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you're right that German leaders didn't understand the United States, but the United States has always had a special sort of spot in the German imagination.
Right.
I mean, they have these Zane Grey novels, which are sort of the German equivalent. Oh, who's that American author who wrote all of these sort of,
Zane Grey.
No, but there's the German equivalent now, and I'm confusing his name. I'm forgetting.
The hero's name is Old Shatterhand.
But there's a German equivalent to Zane Grey. He writes all of it. He's never been to the United States. For all I know, I've never read him. Maybe he just plagiarized Zane Grey. He just did it in German. But you know, the Germans have had a fascination with the United States. It's the land of unbegrenzte Möglichkeiten, you know, unlimited possibilities. And so it was a natural destination. And you know, one of the places that profits the most from German immigration is Hollywood. If you look at the cast of Casablanca, half of them were in the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, a 1919 German expressionist film. So you have, it's just, the connections are fun.
The Europeans throughout